with the harrowing account of the massacre of civilians in a village in Yugoslavia. The story of the killings helps to explain why Yugoslavia's confusing civil war has been so bitter and why repeated ceasefires have all collapsed within hours. There have been many brutal acts by both sides in the 5 months of civil war between Serbs and Croats. The difference this time was that those who died were killed by people they knew, by people they'd lived alongside for years. The massacre happened last month as rival factions fought in the countryside just south of the main road from Zagreb to Osijek, near the town of Podravska Slatina. Serbians from the village of Balinci briefly captured the Croatian village of Četikovac, just 50 yards away. They killed 24 people in a matter of hours before being driven off. Our reporter Paul Davis in Croatia tells the story of the villagers murdered by their neighbors. The story inevitably includes some distressing pictures.
Before the outbreak of violence in Yugoslavia, the tiny Croatian village of Četikovac, population just 400, was a place where Croats and Serbs coexisted in peace. Today, its burnt-out buildings and 24 fresh graves in a local churchyard are testimony to one of the most appalling massacres of this bloody civil war, the full horror of which is only now emerging. On September the 4th, Croatian National Guards and police launched an attack to recapture Četikovac 24 hours after it had been occupied by Serbian militia. As the Serbian irregulars known as Chetniks fled, the first accounts of atrocities came from villagers, many of them wounded, who had been hiding in the surrounding cornfields to escape the Chetniks. "They've slaughtered our people," she said. Inside the village, distraught women pointed the way to scenes of carnage. One body after another discovered as the Croatians moved through the devastated hamlet. The survivors claimed men and women, old and young, had been murdered by Serbians from the next village. Many of the male victims had been shot in the back. An elderly brother and sister, Marko and Manda Rukovina, were found dead at the foot of a wall. In a cellar, the bodies of 91-year-old grandmother Razika Vlatkovic and 76-year-old Ika Buteric both had been shot. In all, 24 bodies were recovered. These pictures were taken by a Croatian man who runs a video shop in the nearby town, Podravska Slatina. Until that day, his normal line of work had been filming local weddings. His harrowing pictures were reminiscent of the worst massacres of the last war. Both Serbs and Croats accuse each other of carrying out wartime atrocities. The slaughter at Četikovac last month was a legacy of much older blood feuds. Before leaving Četikovac, it's claimed the Serbians set fire to many of the houses. They even slaughtered the livestock. One survivor, Matilda Butarak, described how a villager called Choro, who had briefly resisted the Serbians, was dealt with.
They ordered Choro to walk to the front of the village cafe. He had thrown down his gun. Then they told him to turn his back to them. That's when they fired 5 or 6 bullets into him, and he fell to the ground.
A candle on the roadside marks the spot where 5 victims died. Their bodies discovered by Ivan Jaklish as he drove into the village.
One of the dead men was Mlakar Mile, my cousin's son. I also saw Sabo Marko. He was wounded calling for help, but 6 men jumped out of the bushes. They swore at me and told me to go away. I said I wanted to take these people to hospital, but they said they'd shoot me. I had to leave.
When the Croatian forces finally entered Četikovac, they found the body of the man who'd been calling for help. He'd been shot through the throat.
Sadly, there have always been atrocities committed during conflict, but what sets this massacre aside, and in one dreadful event highlights the tragedy of Yugoslavia, is the fact that it was committed not by an invading army, but by people who grew up alongside their victims.
The ones who killed my son were his school friends. I remember he was always lending the money. He had more than them, so he helped them. They were friends.
Most of the Serbians said to have taken part in the massacre lived in Balanci, a village just 50 yards up the road from Chetikovac. The two communities shared a school and shop. Although the attackers wore masks, Milan Butarek says it was easy to recognize people he'd known all his life.
One of them was Romic Svetislav, and because I knew him quite well, I was hoping they would release us. But he just acted like he didn't know me. Our fathers used to be very good friends. But when I realized he wouldn't help me, I knew I could expect no help from any of them.
Post-mortems revealed the full extent of injuries inflicted by one neighbor on another. Even the elderly had been shown no mercy.
The 91-year-old lady Vlatković Rozika had been shot with a hunting rifle. The bullet shattered her arm and passed clean through her body.
A captured Serbian officer interviewed by Croatian journalists while under armed guard in hospital said he believed the Chetikovac massacre was retaliation for the killing of Serbs in a village called Jasinac.
I didn't take part in the Chetikovac, but I heard what happened was revenge for Jasinac.
Hundreds of mourners attended the mass funeral of the Chetikovac victims. Every family in the village had lost relatives or close friends. There was a gun salute for the village policemen who tried to fight off the attackers. The victims were buried alongside each other. Today, Chetikovac is patrolled by Croatian National Guards. Only a handful of villagers have returned to their homes. It's left to the armed men to look after the livestock. The men who allegedly carried out the massacre are believed to be hiding in the surrounding woods, Serbian-held territory. The villagers are planning to rebuild Chetikovac. Some of them are also planning revenge.
If I find the one who killed my son, if I can catch him, if I'm strong enough, one day I'll make him pay, no matter how long it takes.
Slavko Koshrov may not get his revenge in his own lifetime, but the names of the victims and the killers will be passed to future generations. In this part of the world, it's not unusual for old scores to be settled by sons or grandsons, which is why any ceasefire agreed today can only be a short-term solution to Yugoslavia's civil war. Paul Davis, News at 10, Chetikovac, eastern Croatia.
Here, the former Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, has expressed surprise and regret at the outcome of the television franchise auction. She told TVAM's managing director, Mr. Bruce Gingell, that she was only too painfully aware of her responsibility for the legislation which resulted in his company losing its franchise. In a personal note, she said, "When I see how some of the other licenses have been awarded, I am mystified that you did not receive yours and heartbroken."
Mrs. Thatcher's handwritten letter, which her friends are saying tonight was intended as a private note and not for publication, was sent before she left for a speaking engagement in Geneva tonight. But Bruce Gingell, livid at the way TVAM is losing its franchise, clearly decided to make it public, indeed to read it out, as evidence that the whole process had not gone as Mrs. Thatcher had intended.
I'm only too painfully aware that I was responsible for the legislation. Yours sincerely, Margaret Thatcher.
Well, there were some gasps of surprise at that, and tonight the head of another TV company which lost out and who was present as the letter was revealed said he'd been astonished by it.
This is Mrs. Thatcher's last-minute conversion on the road to Damascus. I just wish she'd spoken out a little earlier. Maybe it would have influenced the ITC's way of proceeding with things. So there's a mixture of awe, amazement. I'm stunned, but I'm also still deeply disappointed and hurt.
It's clear that Mrs. Thatcher, who regarded the television industry as the last bastion of restrictive practice, saw TVAM as the very model of a TV station, especially after the long and bitter strike there over manning levels. She also believed that an extraordinary circumstances clause added to her idea of a straight franchise auction would protect the likes of TVAM. But as the broadcasting bill went through its committee stage in the Commons, a quality threshold was introduced. One MP who sat on the committee and who defended Mrs. Thatcher tonight says that changed the name of the game.
I just personally
a little bit regretful that exceptional circumstance, we argued very hard to get that in the bill. It was never used, but I don't think that's what Mrs. Thatcher had in mind in the comment she's made in the letter.
Yes.
But like the employees of another losing company, TVS, opened by Mrs. Thatcher some years ago, and where some employees now want the commemorative plaque removed from the building, other Tory MPs, including another who helped shape the bill, are angry. They think Mrs. Thatcher's now questioning the Act Parliament approved.
We've got an extremely good and effective piece of legislation. It's important that all backbenchers, whatever grade they are, should be loyal to that.
In the Commons, Labour demanded a government statement. The Leader of the House said he hadn't seen the letter and the matter was nothing to do with the government.
It is the case that the operation of the system, the allocation of the licenses, is a matter for the ITC and not a matter for government, and it was the ITC which made the decision.
But the opposition say Mrs. Thatcher's letter shows how bad the franchise allocation has been.
It's the nearest she's ever got in her political life to an apology, but it's crocodile tears because she set this farcical, ludicrous system up.
I think Mrs. Thatcher seems to be discovering, rather long after the event, she wasn't infallible, after all, and neither was her legislation.
But Mrs. Thatcher's intervention, however embarrassing for the government, will not alter things. The government says that the ITC has done its job and that any changes now would have to be a matter for the courts. Michael Brunson, News at 10, Westminster.
The number of people out of work rose again last month for the 18th consecutive month. Almost 36,000 more people were made unemployed in September, taking the total to nearly 2.5 million. But it was the smallest rise since October last year. Unemployment has risen steadily this year, with big increases in February, March and April. The government says this month's relatively small rise means the recession is coming to an end. The Shadow Employment Secretary, Mr. Tony Blair, said the figures were further proof that the recession was not coming to an end. A survey by the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors says unemployment and repossessions are strangling hopes of a recovery in the housing market.
This flat has been repossessed by a building society. The former owner lost his job and couldn't pay his mortgage. Desperate, almost as an act of protest, he stripped the flat and took the light fittings, the power points and even the toilet seat. Once worth £120,000, it's now on the market for £70,000. These repossessed properties on sale at rock-bottom prices are dragging down the values of other houses and flats.
Most of the repossessed houses are in the lower price range, and that means, of course, that people aren't selling, so it's stopping the opportunity of them climbing higher up that market ladder, and obviously the sale of those properties are affected as well.
I expect that we will see greater numbers of more expensive houses being brought to the marketplace without the owners' real wish that that be the case.
A polite way of saying that there are as many large houses as small flats being deserted by owners who can't keep up with the mortgage payments. In 1989, only 16,000 houses were repossessed. In 1990, 44,000. In the first half of this year, 37,000 homes were repossessed. Some say the figure for the whole of this year could be 100,000. So estate agents will struggle to sell these houses, as well as all the other properties put on sale by people wanting to move. But because unemployment is rising, buyers are scared off.
They've got to be careful of their jobs, and more people are losing their jobs than are going into jobs, and that's where the problem lies, the old word, confidence.
It's hard to be confident with so many houses repossessed and boarded up, and with the jobless total set to rise well into next year, there's no sign yet of any recovery in house prices.
Texan police said the gunman who shot dead 22 people yesterday in America's worst massacre may have done it because of a hatred of women. They've been shown a letter in which the gunman, George Hennard, described women as female vipers.
They're clearing up after a killing spree that has stunned this town. George Hennard had 28 bullets left in his guns when he shot himself. Detectives searched the cafeteria, trying to piece together when and how he'd fired dozens more. They searched, unaware that one survivor was still hiding inside, in a large dishwasher, terrified to come out. Relatives of the 22 dead came to pick up personal belongings and to look. Survivors have been reunited and are reliving their horror.
He had a very blank look, He was kind of calm. It wasn't very fast shots. It was like a shot and like he was just kind of randomly picking targets, then another shot, you know, calm.
The police showed a photograph of the killer, but have no idea what his motive was.
We may never know the answer.
Hennard's house has been cordoned off. He lived here alone, a man who had aggravated his neighbours, one of whom read a bizarre letter he'd sent to her.
Please give me the satisfaction of someday laughing in the face of all those mostly white, treacherous female vipers from those 2 towns who tried to destroy me and my family.
14 of his 22 victims were women. It's the largest massacre by a single gunman in recent history. But Texas is a state where guns are a way of life. And as they watched the news of the massacre this morning in Killeen, they had only one regret.
If somebody in there yesterday at Luby's had been carrying a firearm, he would not have killed as many people as he did.
Much of the shock and anger is because what happened here was not the work of a stranger or a drifter from another state, but that of a man from their own community, carrying out a calculated massacre in their midst. School children who'd heard the killings played them out before class this morning. But in spite of the horror, the U.S. Congress voted today to make no changes in laws that allow people to carry semi-automatic weapons. Americans will keep their freedom and live with the consequences, as they are now the families of 23 more victims in central Texas. Bill Neely, News at 10, Killeen.
Soviets have allowed a British television crew into one of its most sensitive defense installations. The bunkers where Soviet missiles are aimed at us to report next. Plus, Mr. Major cancelled some third world deaths. And death on the Nice to Paris line. That's in a couple of minutes.
Madame, I'll deal with it. Hello, do you come out on bank holiday? Ah. What do you mean it's not your area? I'm trying to. It's dark. All I'm listening to here, nothing to worry about. What? No credit card? And no, it's not important. I'll call someone else.
Desmond, what about calling Talking Pages?
We've all the time calling total strangers.
If you need something quickly, call Talking Pages. We'll help you find the right shops and services in your area.
Hello, Talking Pages. Ah, I wonder if you could help.
Yes, we have 3 plumbers in your area who have an emergency service.
Thank you so much.
You all right?
Yes, he's just looking for the fish.
Call Talking Pages on 021 711 1177 and we'll do the searching for you.
Hello there. You know, sometimes photocopiers really crease me up. That's why Canon have made theirs simple enough to use, standing on your head. Just like this. So don't get a headache, get a Canon. On paper. If anyone can, Canon can.
Besides being an award-winning newspaper, the Daily Mail now has a special magazine section every day. On Mondays, Sports Pictorial freeze-frames all the most dramatic action. On Tuesdays, Good Health asks and answers the medical questions that matter. On Wednesdays, Money Mail will help your money make more money. On Thursdays, Female Magazine, vital reading for every modern woman. Fridays, People enters the private world of the rich and famous. And the Mail on Saturday is the perfect guide to making the most of your weekend. With a special magazine section every day, you're buying so much more than a newspaper, the Daily Mail.
Having a plan from Equity and Law, very sensible. Automatic rotary action, cat polisher. Not so sensible.
Equity in Law, polished performance since 1844.
Is my name. Black coffee with not a thing. Hot black coffee now. Freshly ground and fully packed. The hot black coffee boy. Well, that's
Rich, dark, Blend 37. A blend of strength.
At Comet, we're offering interest-free credit on top-name products over £250. So hurry. For interest-free credit, you know where to come.
NATO defence ministers have confirmed the biggest nuclear arms cuts in the alliance's history. 80% of NATO's nuclear arsenal in Europe was signed away at the meeting in Italy. The ministers said they were worried about who controls the Soviet Union's weapons, Moscow or individual republics. A camera crew from Thames Television has become the first to see inside a Soviet missile bunker.
Behind this innocuous-looking gateway in a Siberian forest, the Thames TV team were given an exclusive look inside a Soviet nuclear missile bunker. The nuclear warheads under these sliding hatches can be targeted on Britain and America 6,000 miles away. Inside the bunker, from where the missiles would be launched, many of the control panels were hidden by curtains.
If you had told me 2 years ago that I would see an Englishman here, I would never have believed it.
Strict safeguards using codes and dual keys prevent accidental or unauthorized launch of nuclear weapons. During the attempted coup in the Soviet Union last August, the Soviet military command took extraordinary steps to safeguard their missiles.
What I can say is that an order was issued that all the mobile missile systems were to return to their permanent positions, and that a number of technical measures were taken to increase the security of our weapons. The strategic rocket forces are too important to get involved in any sort of political provocation.
Central control over these big strategic nuclear weapons may be tight, but thousands of smaller bombs are still stored in republics like the Ukraine. Concern about who will control those weapons in future was expressed today by NATO ministers, a concern that seemed to be echoed by some of the young soldiers who guard the missile bunkers.
We are the most important military forces. The defense of our country depends on us. But I must say that things in our country are not getting any better. The Union is falling apart.
A stark reminder of what such weapons do came with a visit to a wasteland nuclear testing site closed to foreigners for the past 38 years. The first H-bomb exploded here was designed by Andrei Sakharov, who later turned against the Soviet system. The site's still radioactive, the landscape scarred with the skeletons of structures built to test the bomb's effects.
Prime Minister's announced that the government plans to write off £500 million owed to Britain by the Third World. He made the promise at a meeting of Commonwealth leaders in Zimbabwe. Canadian Prime Minister Mr. Brian Mulroney said his country would match Mr. Major's pledge.
The Prime Minister is said to be dissatisfied with the progress of talks on debt relief for the world's poorest countries. To force the pace, he's willing to write off £500 million owed to Britain. No surprise that that was welcome here. The British decision affects 3 Commonwealth countries. Many others would benefit if John Major's lead is followed by the rest of the so-called Paris Club of the world's richer nations. The conditions for the proposed relief: it's designed for countries where the average income is around £400 a year and which have to pay at least a quarter of the money they earn from exports simply to service the interest on their debts. But they must also have accepted economic reforms drawn up by the International Monetary Fund. Some 20 countries could see £10 billion of debt written off, 2/3 of what they owe.
These are the very poorest countries in the world. The average income for people in those countries is about £400 a year or less. The people with least income in those countries are therefore by definition very poor indeed. And the best way to help them is to help their countries actually produce a better performance for the future. Removing the debt burden by writing it off seems to us to be the best way to help.
By dinner time this evening, the leaders had dealt with the once vexed questions of South Africa and sanctions. It seems likely they will endorse in some form a proposal for dropping sanctions in stages linked to progress in South Africa. It does appear that Britain may, after all, ask for its disagreement on sanctions to be recorded in the final declaration. But that's not causing undue concern in the British camp. They're pleased by what they describe as the clear skies above today's meeting. Edward Sturton, News at 10, Harare.
America's Secretary of State, Mr. James Baker, spent 7 hours discussing plans for a Middle East peace conference with the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir today. The Israelis say some problems remain, but they could be settled tomorrow. The sticking point is believed to be the make-up of the Palestinian delegation to the conference.
16 people have been killed and 62 injured in the worst train crash in France for 3 years. The crash occurred just outside Paris when the overnight sleeper express from Nice was hit by a goods train. The impact was so severe that the sleeper's first carriage was pushed over the locomotive, pulling it. Many travellers were trapped inside and had to be cut free by rescue workers. The European Commission has asked Britain for assurances that a number of building projects, including the Channel Tunnel rail link, won't result in lasting damage to the environment. Commissioners say they may go to law to stop them. Another of the projects the EC is concerned about is the proposed M3 motorway across Twyford Down in Hampshire. The Department of Transport said tonight it was considering the contents of the EC's letter.
The campaigns for 3 by-elections to be held on November 7th have begun, with the health service and the economy set to become the campaign issues. The by-elections are in the safe Labour seat of Hemsworth and 2 Tory marginals, Kincardine in Deeside and Langbar in Cleveland.
Langbath is just the kind of constituency which will decide who wins the next general election. Fertile Labour territory in the industrial coastal areas, fervent Conservatives in the lush countryside which covers most of its 500 square miles, and no single issue so far dominating the campaign. The Tories are out on the street preaching a gospel of economic recovery, and they're trying to quell public anxiety about the future of the National Health Service.
The health service will be debated, and the better our position looks, the more the Labour Party will try to bring out those smears and scares.
Labour is making play of the fact that this local ambulance station has been shut, and that unemployment in villages like Skinning Grove tops 20%. None of the adults on this football pitch has a job. They say it amounts to a referendum of the government's competence.
Labour's going to nail the lie that Conservatives are competent to run the country, and we're also going to drive another nail into the Conservative government's coffin.
Over at the Liberal Democrats, though they were badly squeezed into 3rd place by Labour at the general election, they insist this is still a 3-way marginal.
I think this time round what we're looking to do is, first of all, to point to the neglect of the Tory government in terms of the constituency, but also the inability of the Labour local authorities to deliver any degree of comfort or support or defence for that. And whereas I suspect the other two are going to be pretty negative in their campaigning, we're going to be quite positive on health and on the environment in particular.
Langbath reads like a dry run for a general election, though the losers will inevitably blame the volatility of by-elections. Holding this seat would be an incalculable boost for Tory morale. Losing it means they'll have to hope for much better economic news to change their fortunes next year. Mark Webster News at 10, Langbath.
And the main news again, Mrs. Thatcher has joined the row over the auction of TV franchises. She told TV AM that they should have kept theirs, and said she was painfully aware that she was the one who started the legislation which resulted in their defeat. And the number of people out of work has risen again for the 18th month in a row. The jobless total is now nearly 2.5 million.
That's news at 10 tonight from Fiona and from me. Good night.